Hello and welcome back to the Cartoonist Studio. And what are we doing this week? Once again, I say the thing I say quite a lot. It's a little bit different. I see a lot of YouTubers out there in their various fields talking about what their industry or what their passion is like. If they're artists, they're talking about the art industry. If they're travelers, they're talking about how to make a living on a boat or in a caravan or on a motorhome. And I thought I'd kind of do a similar type thing, but I'd talk about the cartoon industry as I now know it and as I remember it when I came into it. And then maybe at the end we'll talk about the possibilities for the future. So that's what it's going to be about, me talking, but rather than just looking at this visage, I'm going to be drawing cartoons, just drawing anything that comes into my head. And I'm going to be doing it with just a normal writing pen, no fancy brushes, pencils, nothing computerized, no end piece in full color. It's just me having a sketch, something I don't very often do and something I quite enjoy. So with that in mind, should we go and see how I can mess up this perfectly good idea? Should we do that? Yes, let's go and do that. Okay, so as we go into it, start up with the first sketch. I'll just put up on the screen what it is that I'm drawing. You'll be able to work it out yourself, hopefully. But what's it been like since I started? Well, I started professionally around about 30 years ago, 32 almost years ago. And in that time, I spent a large portion of it fully self-employed. But there have been periods, like now, where I'm a part-time cartoonist because the industry has, well, nosedived, I guess, is the way of putting it. Now, I appreciate there's a lot of cartoonists out there who are just starting out on their journey and they're thinking, is it worth going into? I hear all these horror stories about how bad the cartoon industry has become and how little work there is out there. Well, yes, I guess in many respects it has gone awful. But let me explain. When I started out, professionally, should we say, at the tender age of 30, although I'd been drawing a lot of cartoons professionally, though not full time, for a good probably 15 years before that, the cartoon world was filled with large syndicated comic strips, artists and writers or collaboration of both, who were making millions of dollars from their product, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars from their products. And in the UK, we didn't really have syndication on the same level that they did in America. But what we had national daily newspapers. You don't have that in America, and in large countries, it's just too vast to actually do that. So you have lots of regional newspapers. Your city newspaper, like the New York Post, for argument's sake, probably had more of a circulation than any of our national newspapers. But what our national newspapers did was they employed cartoonists to run a comic strip every day, 6 days a week. And what they do is, like you'd imagine when I signed on with my agent back in the early 80s, he told me then, now the average income then for just an average job, should we say, the average income in the early to mid 80s was right about £10,000 to £15,000 a year. That would have been about, I don't know what it would be in dollars. Anyway, but it was about £10,000 to £15,000 a year. Now, a cartoonist working in a national newspaper, like the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror, Star, Sun, Express, that kind of thing, they could expect to get between £35,000 and £42,000 a year. That's an awful lot more than, say, the £10,000 to £15,000. So it was a good job to have. On top of that, if they had a good agent, they do a lot of advertising work, or there was loads of, no, actually, before I jumped to the advertising, there was a lot of the newspapers, a lot more magazines, and most of them carried cartoons, single panel, spot gags, whichever you call it. And a lot of the newspapers would also carry those as well as the comic strips, and it'd have should we say, like a column of say 4 or 5 in there, and then a couple of pages later they'd have another column, and then so on and so forth. And there were magazines out there, weekly magazines, that were general news items that would cover the news for the whole week. They didn't have they didn't have a political bias, should we say. They just published the best stories. They ran syndicated stories from around the world, and they would absolutely clog up their magazine or their newspaper with single panel cartoons and little cartoon strips. And there was other magazines, women's magazines, specialist magazines, housekeeping, the Tailor's Digest, all sorts of stuff like that. And they would run specialist cartoons, and they'd run them all over their magazines. So there was a huge, huge market. And those cartoons would run from, say, £10 a cartoon up to £45 a single panel cartoon. So as you can imagine, if you drew about 30 or 40 cartoons and you sent them out to the highest payers first, and they come dribbling back with maybe 1 or 2 acceptances or rejections, you then send them out to the next highest payer and so on and so forth until you got to the £10 here. But you could make a living, and cartoonists did make a living from just single panels. So there was that market as well. Plus there was local newspapers would often employ a local cartoonist. So if you had, say, the larger cities like Birmingham and Manchester, Liverpool, these are the cities outside of London, they would then employ artists to do a pocket cartoon, a pocket political cartoon. And that would run, and they'd often get them to do a cartoon strip as well to fill their day up, really, I guess. And then you had the London Evening Standard, which was the main newspaper for London. And that ran at a circulation higher than a lot of the smaller national newspapers like the Telegraph and the Times, not necessarily the Times, but the Guardian and newspapers like that. So they literally paid their political cartoonist, who at the time was a guy called Jack. I think they paid him roughly about what they'd pay a national newspaper political cartoonist. I think that was slightly higher than the cartoon strip. I think it was up between the 50 and 70,000. So it's quite a lot more. So you can see from just working in newspapers alone, you could make a good income. If you had a comic strip and you sold single panel cartoons, you had quite a decent income. You could be up to sort of £60,000 a year. And if you're a political cartoonist that did single panel cartoons, it was through the roof. You could be bringing in around about 90,000 a year back in the 1980s. And on top of that, if you had a good agent, which I mentioned just briefly earlier on, if you had a good agent, then you could get advertising work. And because those days the companies were still state-owned, shall we say, we had British Gas and the National Grid, and the post office was run by the government. A lot of large business, the Water Authority, that was run by the government. They would have calendars, corporate calendars, which they'd send out to their big clients. And those calendars, once again, back in the 80s, mid-80s, start of the 90s, shall we say, the cartoonists would start their year off with a calendar, sometimes 5 calendars, sometimes 10 calendars. And they'd get roughly around about £1,000 to £1,500 as the decade moved on per illustration. And there were 13 illustrations in the calendar, 12 monthly ones and the cover. And they would, which you imagine if you're getting £1,000 a picture, £13,000 for that calendar. This is on top of whatever else you're earning. And like I say, if you had 10 calendars, you were earning instantly, at the start of the year, you were earning £130,000 a year, plus your comic strip, plus your single panels. You can see these cartoonists were getting high up almost to £200,000 a year, because there was other advertising work as well. Advertising agencies were employing cartoonists to make their point. They were going in national newspapers, or they were going on the side of the hoardings in the tube stations in London, and on the side of the hoardings on railway stations. And they were going up on big boards in the city centres. So, cartoons were in demand, and the cartoonist was working hard. On top of that, you could do comic book work. There was, in the early 80s, very early 80s, you probably had about 6, 7 comics. In the 70s, there were probably about 12, 13, 14, 15 titles. And this was before you started to get the mass-produced horrible stuff like the Disney things and the Nickelodeon comics and all those just corporate horror stories that you now get that have killed the comics industry. And So yeah, you could make a tremendous amount of money as a cartoonist. And then we had the recession caused by the financial money markets and the corporate banking. And we had the big crash in the sort of the start of the noughties, shall we say. And it was horrific. I mean, everyone suffered. So much suffering went on, except, paradoxically, the money markets and the financial people who had caused it. They actually made a profit from it. But that's for a whole new channel and corporate greed. Yeah, big subject. So everyone else suffered. And I can remember sitting here in the UK, and we get this like a daily counter of the amount of American newspapers, because obviously at the time America had the largest market for newspapers. These newspapers were crashing, and I don't know whether you remember the old TV shows in the 70s where they had the credits would roll so fast that you couldn't read the names. But it was almost like that. It was a roll call of the newspapers that were collapsing that week or that day. And by the time the media bloodbath had ended or slowed down, because it still carried on afterwards, but slowed down at the frantic pace that it was crashing around our ears at, it was almost a third, well, I'd say probably about a third of the markets in American newspapers had just gone, disappeared, never to come back. And a lot of them, admittedly, were small local newspapers. But then you had a lot of the bigger ones were starting to go as well, and they were crashing. And newspapers were looking to make savings because when they did start to recover, a lot of the newspapers thought, well, sod this, we'll go online. We don't have the print costs, so that'll cost us a lot of money. And, youngsters now, they're not getting their misinformation from newspapers. They're getting their misinformation from the new rising tide of social media. So everything went over to social media, and the newspapers were crashing down because of that then. So the newspapers thought, we got to save money. So a lot of them went online. Even the ones that survived had an online version just to get the youngsters reading it, because youngsters didn't then and still don't now. Largely, they don't buy newspapers. You get a few of them do. It's mainly my generation, maybe a bit younger, and the generations above that buy a newspaper. I don't buy a newspaper because I was always told never to listen to lies when I was young. So I don't listen to newspapers because, by and large, they tell lies. So anyway, that's where that went. So they're thinking, how can we make savings? And the easy, soft target in this country initially was the comics, the cartoon strips. I remember a story when I used to work for the Daily Mirror. They had a new editor, an idiot, an absolute idiot. You know him as Piers Morgan. He was still Piers Morgan then, but he was about 30 years old, still wet behind the ears, and they gave him a national newspaper to play with. I mean, how stupid can you get? Anyway, this idiot had the cartoon editor came in, and the cartoon editor told me the second he walked through the door, he just saw this chart of all the cartoon strips, and he thought, uh-oh, it's axing time. I got axed along with another cartoon strip. And initially, this idiot, Morgan, was going to get rid of Andy Capp, because Andy Capp, he paid him the most money. He thought, get rid of him, we'll make a real savings. Until it was pointed out to the dopehead that the reason why Andy Capp gets paid so much money is he effectively pays everyone here at Mirror Group Newspapers wages, because he was syndicated in America, and he was syndicated to about 1,250 newspapers worldwide. And there was merchandising, and he was bringing in millions of pounds a year for Mirror Group newspapers. So he was paying everyone's wages, so you can't get rid of him. And Morgan said, oh, well, I guess we better keep him then. Idiots. So what they decided to do was the last two in, first two out. They didn't look at the popularity charts, which my cartoon strip was up in the top 3 out of 7. He decided to say last two in, first two out. And that was me and this other cartoon. So my career in Fleet Street ended that day. So they then dropped a lot of the cartoons. And they definitely dropped the single panels. A lot of magazines went under, along with it their markets for single panels. Advertising agencies decided to move to photography and animation. So that was that market out, unless you were a cartoonist who worked in animation. So that all ended. And that left us with greeting cards. And then greeting cards went to photography as well, with the hugely popular, I don't know whether you have them in America or not, the hugely popular range where they were all black and white photos. So they weren't even taking original material. They were taking old photos from the 1950s and 40s and then putting humorous captions on what they thought the people were saying. They were, I think it was called emotional rescue. I think that was the range, and that's what they were called. That's what they were called, emotional rescue. That's right. They were great, but it took the market for cartoonists. Greeting cards took a dive because then came on things like something pig, I think a Moon Pig, which was an online greeting card company. They bought all the old designs from the greeting card companies, the ones they could no longer use or had run out of their value, and they put those up there, and then people just bought the card with their own personalized message, and then Moonpig would send that design on to whoever the recipient was. So the greeting card market started to die. This is all largely to do with initially the financial worldwide financial crash, and then social media and the rise of the leviathan that is the internet. I know these things happen. Stuff happens. TV came along and damaged the movie industry. Kindle came along and damaged the book industry. The netbook agreement came along and destroyed the income for a lot of struggling authors. So, it's just history. It happens. I was unfortunate that I got caught up when it all went wrong. So what happened then? Well, it didn't stop there. It may have taken a few more years, but the likes of the idiot Murdoch, who owns, I would say, probably a quarter of the world's media industry in various forms or another, he decided that with the syndicated cartoon strips, he was going to cut them right back, if not throw them out. So you had a huge drop in syndication. I mean, it had been decimated by the idiots in the financial market. Now it was being destroyed by a soulless moron, cretin, horrible creature. I mean, what he did to the newspaper industry, full stop, was horrible. But on the individual markets, he also destroyed or has destroyed the cartoon market. Syndicates still exist, and I do still send the odd cartoon over to them. But a lot of them have bought up other ones, and I think there's only about 3 or 4 now. I think there's King Features. Universal Media is now called Universal UClick, and is absolutely impossible to get hold of. I've tried many ways. It's so difficult. I've sent, in the end, I posted it out to their Kansas address, hoping like hell that it gets to them, but there's no way because they just don't answer anymore. And I think there's Creator Syndicate as well. Correct me and put your comments below if there is any more syndicates out there, because I don't know of them and I can't find them anymore. And the ones that I have found, their websites or the articles about them are so dated that it's hard to sort of remember. So anyway, it's hard to know whether they're still in existence. Sorry. So if you do know of any syndicates other than King Feature Syndicate, Tribune Media, and Universal UClick, or what did I say? Universal UClick, Tribune Media. No, Tribune Media's gone. Universal UClick, King Features, and Creators. If you know of any more than that are still in existence, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you. That'd be great. So that market is dying terribly. So what syndicates were doing is they were putting packages together. They were selling a package of, say, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cartoon strips, and they were selling them at a reduced rate to the newspapers. So the newspapers were buying cartoon strips as a block. So that meant that the cartoonists were now struggling for a percentage of that block fee because the syndicates weren't paying them what they got before. So unless you had a massively successful cartoon strip like Garfield, you were pretty much out of a job. You were pushed right to the back. I mean, you had a few which were coming up. You had the wonderful Pickles, but once again aimed at the older generation because those were the only ones reading the newspapers. And you had Dilbert, who I was, Dilbert's it's an acquired taste, not because of the content of the cartoon. It's because it's written about office work, and unless you work in an office, I think it was definitely aimed more at that. I know we did have a few flights of fancy and what have you, which took place in an office, but could have been understood by anyone. But then he went and upset the world. People have different views on that. Some people call him a racist. Some people call him a realist. Some people say he was just saying it as it is, and others we were riding the wave, or the woke wave at the time, and people got those sort of people got upset and just saw him as a target, and the newspapers and syndicates acted predictably and just fired him, which left, I don't know how many newspapers he was in. I think it was the high thousands, maybe even 2,000. I don't know. But that left all those gaps open. But did they get fed? No, they didn't, because it was at that time that Rupert Murdoch decided to announce his dropping of all the cartoon strips. So there you go, that was that. So we're left with this market which is devoid of single panels, devoid of cartoon strips, or very few of them. Greeting cards have gone largely to photography, although they have sort of come over a little bit back to cartoons, but not much. Advertising, no. Calendars, well, they're owned by corporations now, corporate monsters. And what they do is the government give them an amount of money to run that business, and whatever they can make in savings or make in profits, that's for them. So, of course, the first thing they do is think, well, how can we cut our costs, because we want more money in our pockets, because we're only billionaires, and how can we survive on that? So we find other ways of doing it. So the calendar was out the window. Well, they didn't need that anymore. They didn't think they needed it. Maybe they didn't. I don't know, but they cut it out. So there's another market gone. And all the markets just diminished bit by bit by bit by bit by bit until eventually you've got this. It's almost like the breadcrumbs scattered around an old lady's foot, and all the pigeons are cartoonists, and we're fighting like hell for those crumbs, when before we were getting slices of bread, loaves of bread in some cartoonists' case. So that was it. That was pretty much the end for cartoonists. But is it the end? Is it the end for cartoonists? I hear you sound. It sounded very great at the start and very doom and gloomy right towards the end. Is it the end for cartoonists? How am I surviving? Well, the honest answer is that I have a part-time job. Like most cartoonists, the only way you can survive loving your art, and it is a love, it is a passion, you can't possibly do this job just for a bit of fun. It is a passion. So how do I do it? Well, I have a part-time job. And then I have little bits of work. I work for a comic company called Rebellion, where I draw a couple of pages on a character called Kid Kong, not my character, an old character they bought the rights for, and I now illustrate, written by someone else. And then I do cartoon strips, specialist cartoon strips. I do one for The Dalesman, which is a Yorkshire newspaper, and I do that about Yorkshire folk. And I also do a specialist cartoon strip for Sherlock Holmes magazine, where I do a spoof of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and Moriarty and the rest of them. And I do caricatures, and I do the odd bit of work for local companies and larger companies, and whatever comes through the door, really. So I'm a jobbing cartoonist, whereas I used to work very largely in comics and make a very good income for myself until things went horribly wrong there. And how else do I make a living for myself? Well, I've got this here YouTube channel, which makes me not a single penny, because I've not got the right amount of subscribers and hours watched. I've got the right amount of subscribers, and the hours watched is slightly shy of what I can get to start getting involved in the ad program. But I've already told you I don't want to get involved in that, because nothing annoys me more than adverts popping up all the time. And I don't want to annoy you, having just got you. So I'm going to forego that. I'm cutting my own nose off to spite my face. It's an income stream I've decided to ignore. But how do I cover that? Well, obviously you know that this is the diary of a cartoonist. It follows my life as a cartoonist, my career, which direction it's going. And at the moment, I'm producing my own books, children's books in the form of Big Old Bear and Ryan's Dinosaur Dreams, more coming along the line of Grandad's School and My Funny Dad, and books like that, which I'm producing at the moment. I also do graphic novels. We've got the Sleepy Hamlet graphic novel, The Night of the Village Idiots. I'm looking to write another one of those. It's written, it's a case of illustrating it. I've also got Castle Comics, which is not on Amazon, not available on Amazon, or if it is, someone's bought one. I think they're selling it for £75. Don't buy it. It's really not worth that. I used to sell them for £5. That gives you some idea. And then there's collections of cartoon strips, the ones I used to run on social media, because that's where all the cartoons have gone. Actually, I will make a point about that, social media. What happened to the cartoonists when it all went wrong? They went online. They tried to ride the online wave. They did web comics, which started to get a lot of followers, and that became a good way to make a reasonable income if you were just on your own. You could go to comic festivals and sell your books. gain in readership, get more people subscribing to your channel. There was some amount of advertisements on there, and they were sponsored, and the cartoonists to make a living that way. They were near as much as they could if they were a successfully syndicated cartoonist, but they didn't need to make as many sales because they didn't have to share the money with the syndicates. So they made the money themselves. That was a good way of doing it. Then social media came along and people stopped watching it on the webcomics. They started putting them on social media, but of course they couldn't charge for that. They didn't own the social media. They owned their own website, but they didn't own the social media. So they were offering the work for free just to try and get people to come over to their other sites and then hopefully get involved in the buying of the books and so on. And so we artists got caught in an extremely vicious circle of offering our work for free. And the people who read it got used to receiving it for free. So when we said to them, buy our books, they said, what for? We're getting it for free. So we kind of shot ourselves in the foot with that one, but it was an experiment that went badly wrong. One that I'm not involved in anymore. I don't offer my work for free. I know the YouTube channel is free, but I'm not offering you a finished cartoon. I'm showing you what I'm producing in a book, and then hopefully you'll go ahead and purchase it. So that's the only other potential income stream, is for me to show you what I'm producing and have you hopefully go over to Amazon, where there are links, universal links in the description below for all the books that I've got at the moment on Amazon, except the Castle Comics. And then hopefully you'll go along and purchase copies. And that gives me, at the moment, it really doesn't make much of a difference to my income. It's nice to get the odd payment into my bank from Amazon. So that's a small way, but it's growing bit by bit. And the more people come on board this channel, the more people there are to mention about my books, and hopefully have them go ahead, take a look, see what they like, buy one. If they like it, then maybe go back and purchase another. I know there are some of you that do that. I've started to buy me a coffee. That's another way of getting an income. It's not a way that you have to constantly go there and sort of subscribe on a monthly fee. If you see something that you like, produced, you enjoyed, I entertained you, I informed you, you thank me by buying me a coffee. Link in the description below. So these are the ways that cartoonists are now turning to make a living. Some of them have taken full-time jobs and they just send out single panels to the literal handful of magazines and newspapers that take them. So you've got all these cartoonists that are now struggling to try and find ways of getting their cartoons above everyone else's. So the magazines that used to get maybe 100, 150 single panels sent to them a week are now getting probably a couple of thousand. So you can imagine their choice is just so vast. And your chance of getting a regular couple of cartoons in there every week or every month, depending on the magazine, is slipping down to oblivion. So that, to me, is the state of the cartoons at the moment. Is there any luck, any good news? Well, there is a slight glimmer on the horizon, and it is a very faint one, but with a little bit of air and a lot of hope and a lot of concentration and people going out there and buying the products, that could grow into a flame, that could go into a raging inferno. The market I'm talking about is graphic novels. Now, it used to be the domain of the superheroes and that kind of stuff. They put all their monthly comics together into one collection. They'd sell the whole story as a trade paperback. But then things like Mouse came along, which is the story of the Holocaust as told through mice and cats and rats and dogs and what have you. That was a full, complete story on its own. And then other ones came along, and more, and then the children market started to produce graphic novels because they realized that little boys would rather read a comic than a book, whereas girls are quite happy to read a book. So they were trying to get boys' literacy levels up, so they started to bring them out in the form of comics or graphic novels. And it then grew, and they got used to doing it. And then you've got the big selling stuff now, like was it Dogman, and I think there's quite a few other ones, and they're growing and growing. And in some cases, their sales are outstripping some of the adult bestsellers. You know, they're taking the likes of Stephen King for a run. So you can see, the more people buy these books, the more publishers will say, we need more graphic novels. And the market and the subject range is just huge. And parents are starting to say, well, you know what? I used to think comics were child fodder, but they're not. In France, you've had the Bande dessinée movement, which is the Franco-Belgian market, which they've had Asterix, Tintin, the Smurfs, Lucky Luke, and a whole load more, hundreds more. You go into a French bookshop and there's a massive section just for this bande dessinée, comic book, graphic novel. They're about 48 pages. They're an easy read, but on all kinds of subjects and characters. And they take them right from early readers up to adults. So the comic book scene is huge out there. So there is a market, but it is a small one. But it is growing, and hopefully it'll continue. And maybe that's the market that cartoonists will go into. That'll be the new syndication, because let's face it, cartoon strips started out like that, and they've now moved to that. It's the reason why we lost Bloom County. It's the reason why we've lost Calvin and Hobbes and a lot of other comic strips. The reduction was just ridiculous. It was talking heads, and no one wants to see that. So, but with graphic novels, you get an entire page. Sometimes you do a whole page for one picture, or lots of small ones where it's talking heads, and you can play with the format, and it's very exciting. And that's the market I'm trying to go into. I'm also writing children's books, children's novel, chapter books with pictures. I'm doing one now. And we'll talk about that in a different video. So there you go. That's my views on what the cartoon market was and what I think it is now, and where I think, if there's any hope, it's going in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one, where we'll probably do something else completely different. Until then, thank you very much for your time. I know it is valuable, and I cherish every second that I spend with you. So have a great fortnight. I'll see you in 2 weeks. And until then, bye-bye for now.